Good morning, everyone. And I know some of you are joining from different time zones. So, good afternoon and good evening. So, I'm Pallavi. A lot of you know me because you've been joining us regularly. So, we are Asian Pathfinders. Today, we have Col Vivek Chadha, Research Fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses. And Sir is going to be speaking about the characteristics and sources of terrorism finance in India. I'll let Shrez, who will be moderating today's session, speak about Sir later, but I'll just give you a brief about us. So, as many of you know, we are a platform to get scholars, practitioners, academics together to have a constructive dialogue, learn from each other, also be an open forum for everyone to come present, as well as for younger professionals to brainstorm ideas, research, learn from each other, especially because in this time of COVID-19 and these uncertain eras, I think it's very important for people to be able to still stay connected. And our is a field, the social sciences field, is a field where we brainstorm ideas, we throw ideas off each other, and then learn from each other. So I think this is very important to have this kind of a forum. So our guiding principles is just that we want to be an open forum for constructive dialogues as well as knowledge sharing. Uh, we do realize that there is a vast area of knowledge out there, which is in, say, the academic circle or the practitioner circle, and sometimes we operate in our silos, so we don't end up actually interacting with each other a lot. This is, I think, using technology, we want to just ensure that all of us come together and have these kind of dialogues. We also want to involve early career professionals, young professionals. In the past, and that means young at heart as well as young at age. And I think it's very important, I think, because a lot of people who are senior to us have a vast knowledge, experience, then they can share with us. But young people also come with different ideas because they have a different way of looking at the world. So I think this is a way to communicate these ideas to each other and possibly find research collaborations, brainstorm on ideas. Any projects that you have in mind and you want to brainstorm here, we're happy to take it on. Just write to us and we'll be happy to discuss it with you and see how we can take it forward. So execution of this idea is obviously the fireside chats, which we have every Saturday at 11. Uh, Standard time, if there is any deviation because of time zones, maybe we'll adjust, but we want to keep it as 11 just so that you remember it on a Saturday morning. I know Saturday mornings are not easy to wake up, but yeah. Also, we have a YouTube channel. Find us there, Asian Pathfinders, and create a knowledge repository for everyone to tap into. And I think the YouTube channel is one of the ways we are doing it. So these are just the potential topics, guiding ones, right? This is, I know, too vast and too broad, but I think it's just trying to fit in different views. And I think our upcoming sessions which I'll talk about in a minute, but just the community guidelines. It's posted in the chat also, but I know we all are mature adults, professionals, so don't need to repeat, but just stick to the theme of the event. Don't make very strong defamatory statements, illegal content. Also, respect intellectual property. That's, I think, one of the key things which we always say, because all of us work really hard on the work that we do. And it's important that if you want to some way, and like we said, it's collaboration. So if you want to use some content in your own research, reach out to the scholars or the practitioners who's presenting and seek their written permission first, and that's very important. And like I said, these are a few of our upcoming sessions. Next week, we have Dr. Alistair Cook and Christopher Chen from RSIS Singapore, and they'll be speaking on how do we reimagine the humanitarian landscape in the post-COVID world or the COVID world. And I think that's very important. We reached out to Dr. Alistair and Christopher because I think issues which are related to humanitarian disasters are not going to reduce, but maybe increase over the coming years. But COVID has changed the way we look at funding and all that. So how is that going to change in the coming years? It's very important, and it cuts across boards, I think, not just for governments, international NGOs, but private organizations also. Then we have Dr. Sabine Kapasi. She's a practicing medical professional. She's been working in the field right now on COVID-19, not just in India, but across the world. So we'll have her joining us, and then few others who are coming up later. So please look out for our LinkedIn and Telegram links to know when these things are happening, the timing, the registration details. And these are just to contact us. You can find me and Shrez on LinkedIn and other social media platforms. So that's there. And it's over to you, Shrez. I'm going to go off now.
Thank you, Pallavi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And welcome all for the 10th session of the Fireside Chats of Asian Pathfinders. My name is Shreyas Deshmukh, and today we have Colonel Vivek Chadha to speak on the subject characteristics and sources of terrorism finance in India. Sir has a very distinguished career of 22 years in the army, where he served in Jammu and Kashmir and Sri Lanka also. And he has 6 books on his name, out of which like low intensity conflict in India analysis, which is a part of recommended readings on terrorism and insurgency in India. And he came with a book called Lifeblood of Terrorism, Countering Terrorism Finance in 2015, when everybody was talking, initiated talks on how the uh, ISIS managing its finances and how it took over Iraq and large parts of Syria. So if anybody wants to read more on the terrorism financing, please, I would refer to go through the search books, which are available on the ID. Some of them are available on the IDSA website. And I'm looking forward to listen, sir, also. So I'll just hand it over to sir. And please do share if you have any question on the chat box, so we can ask sir after his presentations. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I think you'll have to enable my screen share.
Sir, I just did. So I just did. Sorry. Yeah.
I hope I'm clearly audible, because there were some people who were indicating in the chat box that the voice was a little feeble. I hope I'm clearly audible.
Now it's good, sir. No problem.
Okay. Thank you so much to you all for getting me over. It's indeed a pleasure. And this interaction with you is between my cycling trip in the morning and the haircut from my wife that I'm due for immediately after this. So I guess these are the signs of COVID times and how we're managing things. So it's really interesting. But since I did speak about cycling, let me encourage all of you, please do cycle. It is the best mode of transportation. Junk your cars unless you really have to use it. Please get onto cycles. So let me speak of something which you might be surprised to hear from a Faji. But anyway, I thought let me convey this message to you before I start. Okay. My interest in terror finance is fairly old now, although I must admit that true to most Fajis who remain in field and spend most of their time looking for terrorists, we are very far removed from the intricacies of terror finance and what it really means to the cause of terrorism and how critical it is to the entire movement of terrorism or insurgency for that matter. And it's only when I started the project I realized the criticality of the subject and the importance of the subject in terms of how it sustains terrorism and insurgency across the world, in India, of course. And I think that is what is really fascinating, and that is the subject of my presentation today. So let me quickly, since I have just about, I think 20-25 minutes now, to give you a gist, a very brief introduction to the subject, and I think we would probably gain much more during the interactive session. So as I see it, there are 3 critical elements which sustain terrorism. I call it the Trinity of Terrorism. You have motivation, which actually comes up from the ideals for which people fight. Now, whether the ideals are acceptable, not acceptable, misconstrued, real, based out of a grievance, or it is artificially manufactured, but the fact is that there is some cause for motivation which drives the people to do what they do. The second element is of establishing control over an area, because unless you have some degree of control over an area, you will not be able to either push your agenda or push the kind of movements that we've seen in the areas. And I think one very important element to which you establish control is that of violence. Violence creates fear, and fear is a tool that most insurgent and terror groups across the world have used very, very commonly. And I think the last and probably the least known is what I call the lifeblood of terrorism, which is how terrorism gets funded and how terrorism sustains itself, because of which you have insurgencies in India which are as old as almost the republic. You have other places in the world where insurgencies, terrorism movements have gone on for decades. And the reason is that besides the fact that they control certain areas or control through certain individuals, their ideology, but a very critical, very important factor is actually of how they fund their insurgencies. And I think that is something that we often tend to lose sight of, and that is going to be the focus of my discussion today. So let me first, to begin with, get on to what are the characteristics of terror finance, because as you would realize, some of these will come as a surprise to you. So let me just quickly get on to each one of them. The first is that most of the money which comes into terrorism or comes as a part of terror finance is actually legal money which flows in. You'll be surprised to hear this, but a lot of it is actually legal money. I will give you a couple of case studies which will further reinforce this point, that money actually comes through banking channels, come in as normal a way as you and I probably receive our salaries at the beginning of the month. And we have case studies which go back to the 9/11 attack. We have case studies which again go back to the 93 bombings in India, a lot of which actually emanated from money being pumped into completely legal forums, completely legal mechanisms for transferring these funds. And in a lot of these cases, it was actually banks, in some cases, of course, multinational banks, which served as conduits for moving this money. So that becomes one major challenge, that your money tends to come from completely legal or legal seeming, at least, sources and channels. The second is that terror finance has known to have exploited and utilized the existing financial system to the hilt. They have been able to use the banking channel, as I indicated to you. They have used alternate channels for moving money. It could be things like online transfers, things like Western Union, things like MTSS, things like even PayPal kind of a system. There is also, of course, a fear amongst people that cryptocurrency could very well again get utilized for funding terrorism. So financial systems of various kinds have been used for funding terrorism. And given the kind of loophole that exists in the financial system, and given the complexity of the international financial system, people who employ them, they actually are able to exploit it to the very hilt. The third factor is the utilization of religion as a tool. Now, what we must realize is that very few terror groups actually believe in the true reality of a lot of religion, the true teachings. But what they do tend to do is that they misconstrue the message, often misconstrue it through selective quoting of messages in order to fulfill their agenda. And when religion becomes a part of these movements, you would realize that there is a degree of sensitivity that gets attached to it. I'm sure you would be aware, or you would have probably seen in your own lifetimes, you go across any major road in any, I guess, major city in India. I've certainly seen it at a number of places in Delhi, where you have either temples or masjids or any other religious place, which even creeps onto the main highways or to the main roads. People are doubly conscious of trying to remove them from there or relocate them from there because of the sensitivities attached. Similarly, I think all of us at some stage or the other would have had people coming to us asking for chanda. Now, these kind of donations that people ask for, it's very rare that you attempt to even go into the roots of who they are, where they come from, and what are their antecedents. And because of the nature of belief that we have in religion in general, and of course specific religions in particular, you tend to give money to a lot of these people without realizing how and where some of this money would land up. And this is something which is extremely common, and it has happened in the case of a number of countries, including in India, where religion has been used as a vehicle to collect and transfer money. The fourth point that I'd like to highlight here is that terror funding has actually evolved much faster than the mechanisms which the governments have to control it and to stop it. You will find every few months or every few years, you hear of a new assessment, a new analysis coming from various bodies which deal with terror finance to indicate that terrorists or terror groups are using so-and-so method now for either generating funds or for transferring funds. We recently had a case where gold has been utilized for moving money or moving value. So you have various ways in which money tends to get utilized. I will just move this to the side just a sec. Yeah, okay. The last point that I wanted to bring up is that unlike popular perception, the funds that you actually require for undertaking a terror strike are minuscule as compared to the funding that is required otherwise to run organizations. Let me give you a very quick example before I move on. Just try and think as to what is it that is required in terms of money to go and place a very crude device in a marketplace in any part of the world. And you would realize that procuring some kind of ingredients for an explosive, it could be professional ingredients or it could be makeshift ingredients, you realize that the costs involved are actually minuscule. What you also realize is that when somebody is motivated to facilitate these kind of strikes, he does not require money from you because of the nature of motivation. Somebody could take a loan to do it. Somebody could just probably drive his car into a crowd, and that is good enough to create havoc within a society. So the funding which is required for a terror strike is minimal. However, there is a caveat. What you really require is funding to run an organization. So terror organizations require a lot of money to run them, just like any other organization elsewhere in the world. But the funding required for strikes is very minimal. So these are, I thought, were some of the characteristics, very interesting characteristics that you would probably may or may not be aware of. I thought, let me begin with that. Let me now straight come on to the model in the Indian context. And this is, I won't say it is a peculiar model, but the fact is it is different from models that are available elsewhere in the world, and I see it as a hybrid model. So when you look at the terror funding cycle, there are three critical stages that come into play. The first stage is your source. You have to ultimately source your funds from somewhere. The second stage is of transferring that money. You have to ultimately, again, transfer the money from one place to another, that is maybe from the source to other places. And the third stage, of course, is the distribution of that money. Now, that distribution could be to the terror groups themselves, to individuals, to overground workers, but whatever the case may be, the third stage is the distribution. So when you look at the terror funding or the terror finance cycle, these are the three stages in which it happens. Now, when we look at the sources can be in broad categorization, either external or these sources could be internal. Now, when we look at, again, external sources, and this is more peculiar to India, I'm sure there are minor variations or even major variations depending on how we look at it, which could be available elsewhere in different countries, different regions, but this is more specific to India. In our case, the biggest share of external funding comes from state funding or state-sponsored funding. The second, of course, is in the form of donations. Now, these donations, I gave you the examples of how money tends to get collected. It could get collected for a variety of reasons from a variety of people, and giving them very different motivations for the collection of that money. It is, of course, also a very large percentage also comes in the form of NGOs. Now, these NGOs, we are aware, if you take the example of Pakistan, how they have been created in some cases as front organizations. In other cases, as far as the people may be concerned, they may not seem to be associated in any form, overtly at least, with terrorism, but they do have their linkages and the money gets transferred. The fourth source is of FICN, that is fake Indian currency notes, counterfeit notes, whatever you want to call them. And the last source is drugs. Now, this could be either money which gets accrued uh, by the cultivation of some of the plants that can create drugs, or it could be taking money from agencies which are transferring drugs, or some kind of protection money from agents and from people who cultivate. But these are the different kinds of sources that have often been cited in terms of external sources. Now, I will give you, of course, specific examples for some of these Now, when it comes to the internal sources, and this is equally prevalent in India, and I'll come to the regions as well after this, the most obvious source, and I think the most common source in the Indian context, is that of extortion. Now, whether you call it extortion in certain states, it also gets termed as taxation, illegal taxation, but that is the primary source for internal funding for a lot of groups in the country. The second source is of crime, and crime could be of any kind. You could probably hear of cases where kidnappings have taken place, or banks have been looted, ATMs have been looted, different kinds of cases where money gets generated through the process of criminal activities. You also have something known as the non-designated financial businesses and professions. Now, this includes a lot of bodies where they are associated in some way or the other with large financial dealings. Now, let me give you a few examples, and again, immediately it will strike you as to how and why they can become sources of terror funding. They're, of course, also used for money laundering. These are cases like the property business, people who handle property, the entire legal fraternity, which again deals with a lot of cases where large amounts of money is handled. You have the gem and jewelry trade, for example. So these are designated non-financial businesses and professions which handle large amounts of money either directly or indirectly, and they get associated with the funding of terror. You also have, to a lesser degree domestically than it is external in India, wherein NGOs come into play, and we've heard of a number of cases where in different parts of the country you've had NGOs functioning as the face of terror organizations, or they could just be functioning as social organizations, merely motivating people either to generate funds or to support the terror organizations. And the last is drugs, again comparatively minimal in the domestic scene, and this is of both varieties. The larger is, of course, taking money for the movement of drugs. We've had cases of groups in the Northeast who charged money like for any other business activity. They've taken money for the movement of drugs. You also have some cases where drug cultivation came up, but they have been far and few over a period of time. The next, of course, is the transfer mechanism. And here things become interesting, because you often tend to see that some of the mechanisms for transfer mistakenly are seen as the sources of money. For example, Hawala is not a source for terror funds. Hawala is a mechanism which you utilize for transfer, and not money, but transfer value, which is a very interesting differentiation with all the other channels, because in all the other channels, you actually find the movement of money taking place. In the case of Hawala, other than the first and last mile, there is no physical movement of money, which makes it that much more efficient, that much more effective. And very interestingly, for a lot of normal people, it also makes it the cheapest way of moving value from place A to place B. I will not get into the details of Hawala here, but I'm sure some question might be there. We can look at those at during the interactive session. But just to suffice to say at this stage that Hawala is one of the most common and most effective ways of transferring value in the case of India, as the case studies have proved, and I'll of course discuss a couple of them with you. Then, of course, is formal channels. I discussed that with you right in the beginning, which is one of the means of transferring money, and you'll be surprised as to what percentage of funds actually get transferred through formal channels, we tend to believe that that would not be the case, but that's not really true. Cash is yet another means of transferring money. It could come in very small denominations through cash couriers. It could come in larger denominations. There are different cases of how it moves, and this includes the FICN, which gets moved in various ways across the border. And I will show you as to how exactly this gets moved as we move on to the presentation. And of course, there is also a way in which trade gets utilized for transferring money. And this is essentially, in very brief, this is essentially done by overvaluing or undervaluing your transactions. For example, if something costs 100 rupees and I value it at 500 rupees, that is one way of generating money, or undervaluing is another way of doing it. It depends on who is the one who's transferring, wants to transfer the excess or the surplus amount as far as the transaction is concerned. And this has not only been utilized under the normal circumstances, but it has also been attempted in the case of physical movement of goods which are exchanged at the border between India and Pakistan. And a couple of cases have come to light, and they have been caught attempting to do so by giving a false value to the products that are being moved. And last stage, of course, is distribution, as I had told you. So very essentially, this was the terror funding cycle. Now let's come on to what exactly are the sources of terror funding for different areas within the country. So when we look at Jammu and Kashmir, the funding, as has been seen, is primarily external. And again, primarily at the behest of Pakistan, whether it comes directly from Pakistan or gets routed through other places, the fact remains that that is the major source of funding of terrorism in J&K. Then on the other extreme, you have the internal sources of funding, and I gave you examples of internal sources of funding, primarily it being extortion, and the left-wing extremism movements. Most movements in the Northeast are funded through internal means of terror funding. And the Indian Mujahideen is one group, of course, which is a healthy mix of both external and internal sources, wherein they have resorted to crime in certain instances, and they have also got money from Pakistan through a variety of means to support their funding. Next, let me come on to some examples and then some linkages that you could possibly derive from that between terrorism, crime, and money laundering. Now, here is one example of someone who was used as a conduit for distributing money in J&K. As you go through this slide, you will see how exactly this happened. So there are two people who meet. One is involved in terror activities. The other, incidentally, is a private school principal. And the principal Saab is, of course, promised 5% commission on distributing money. He falls for the lure and accepts this proposal. Now, the money that gets transferred into a branch of J&K Bank in Srinagar from December 07 to July 11 is a little over 22 lakhs. Now, the total withdrawal that happens during this period is about 18 lakhs. In between, the principal realizes that he'll find it probably difficult to do the distribution on his own. So what he does is that he hires somebody on a commission who could distribute some of the money for him, and this gets distributed for the purpose of funding, supporting terrorism in the valley. Now, when you look at this particular case study, you realize that the individual who was recruited in this particular case was done in a way that he was unlikely to be suspected. You would also realize that here was a case where a perfectly legal channel was utilized to deposit the money and to withdraw the money. And unfortunately, despite the amounts, although I'm sure they were small and intermittent, it did not raise red flags in the legal channels, which allowed him to continue to distribute the money for the period that he did. And I think it tells you how simple funding can be and the kind of variety of means that can be utilized to do so. Let me give you another example. Now, here is a case of funding by the Falai Insaniyat Foundation from Pakistan. The amount is given on the slide. You can have a look at that. Now, this is a different case. Here is a businessman who suffers huge losses in his business. Now, he goes to Saudi Arabia, perfectly legal religious activity, follows up with a visit to Dubai. He meets a Pak national there who again offers to move funds to him through Hawala this time. And this individual, of course, recruits 2 couriers for the distribution activity thereafter. And what do we see in this particular case? Here was a businessman who was obviously vulnerable. He had suffered losses and gets targeted. There's a meeting that takes place, follow-up meeting again in Dubai. Very interestingly, he is not from areas that you would normally suspect. He actually happened to be from Haryana. Hawala is a channel that gets utilized for transferring the value of the entire amount that is done. The money, of course, gets transferred for building a religious or a religion-linked institution, part of which, of course, gets funneled for terror activities. And you realize that, of course, as usual, couriers get utilized in this case as well to support the funding activity. Now, let me give you the last case study before we move on. And here I have given you data that I have collated from the NIA website of cases of FICN that have been distributed within India. What it gives you is the location from where the FICN gets moved, via the place it gets moved, to the destination that it goes to, the total amount, the cases where the information was available, the denomination, and very interestingly, the accused and the dates, of course. Please have a careful look at the accused, and on purpose I've marked certain names in red. What you can make out from here is that there is a certain hub which emerges in terms of where the money is getting collated and where it comes from and how it reaches this destination. I will tell you a little later. You see that it does not necessarily go directly to the destination. It could move via some other place. Amongst the destinations, generally speaking, you would find that there are places which are metros, which have large utilization of currency notes, very large amounts of money which gets moved on a daily basis. It's easier to hide it there. Now, you would also realize that obviously the denomination that is largely likely to be used is the largest. It facilitates ease of movement, ease of transfer. And of course, the column which I said is very interesting. What I want to indicate here is that this is how and this is where it gets closely linked with criminal activities. Now, we tend to see this purely as terror funding. And as soon as you say terror funding, you associate certain countries, certain individuals with it. But what I want to highlight here is that for a criminal, whether it is distribution of drugs or distribution of fake Indian currency notes, ultimately it's a question of profit. Wherever he finds profit, irrespective of which area, which religion, which denomination he belongs to, he will undertake the activity. And here is a case study which I wanted to utilize to highlight this aspect. And let me also very quickly and very briefly tell you that when Pakistan started producing fake Indian currency notes, it was of course done in their official government presses. It has been proved in a case in 2014 in India. They have been indicted. They would actually charge such a small amount to deliver it to the distributor that despite that small amount, they were actually deriving a profit on it. Let us say a 2,000 rupee note is handed over for 400 rupees. The cost of production is much lower than that. The distributor gets such a huge margin because he buys it at 400, probably gives it to the next chap at 1,000 or 1,100 rupees. And imagine how much that chap who's finally circulated in the market is liable to gain. It's a high risk activity, but a high gain activity, which is why you find that there are a number of takers to undertake this activity. So like I mentioned, Malda, the hub, Bangladesh, one of the most prominent routes for doing it. I'll of course come to a map which will show you the details. Background of the accused, I told you, criminal intent is what is the factor. Preferred denomination we've seen, major metros where it gets distributed, and cross-border movement is evident. And here is a map which tells you where this cross-border movement takes place, the means which are employed for the cross-border movement. What you see, the stars are the landing points, the circles are the transit points, the triangle is the source point, which in this particular case, of course, happens to be Pakistan. Different kinds of routes utilized, land, rail, air, everything has been used in the past. And there are third countries which are least suspected, sometimes in Southeast Asia, which are used as transit to move the money there first and then onto some of the landing areas within the country. So I thought I'll just show you this map to give you an idea. And here is again one more interesting slide quickly before I end. It gives you an idea of the counterfeit currency reports that have been generated. This is not the number of notes, but the reports, and different places, segments from which they get generated over the years. So you see public sector banks, private banks, foreign banks, other financial institutions, and the total. Now, again, it's very, very interesting when you look at the chart, because look at how the increase has taken place. At one level, you could have a look at that. Secondly, look at the share of reports of public sector banks, private banks, foreign banks. Now, it actually tells you something very, very interesting. What it tells you is that despite the fact that more than 2/3 of the business of banking in the country is with public sector banks, the reports are being generated more from the private entities and, relatively speaking, even from foreign banks as compared to the public sector banks. Could possibly be two reasons. One, public sector banks, extremely efficient, very, very effective. People are scared of going there. Number two, people probably realize that they will not get caught when they land up with the public sector banks and prefer to go there, and because of which the reports that are getting generated are very few. That gives you an idea as to what are the kind of scrutinizing measures that have been put in place in different places, and there are some institutional reasons as well. I will not go into them at this stage, maybe during the interactive session. All right, last, and this is my last slide. I just want to show you this slide once again and tell you, look at the external sources, look at each one of them, and you will realize that there's not a single source as far as external funding is concerned where Pakistan is not the primary agent. The source, the reason, or the place from where the transfers are either generating or being masterminded into India. And all these activities and more are actually being utilized by Pakistan to fund terrorism within the country. Let me end here. And I think we should move on to the interactive session. Otherwise, I'll eat into that time frame. Yeah, I finished. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful presentation. And just taking from your last point, I just have one question, and later.
Shreyas, I am not being able to hear you here.
Can you hear me, sir?
The volume is very low.
Can you hear me now? No?
Shreyas, if it's okay. Sir, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, Shreyas, sorry. I'll just ask Sir the questions, and Shreyas, I'll take your question in the chat. Question from me, because I have the mic now. So, how have terrorists exploited the digital space for raising funds? And has the use of digital currencies and digital payment apps increased for terrorism funding?
Should I take the questions one by one?
Sure, sir. I'll just because I'll read the next one then. So you can start with.
Okay. Very interestingly, this is one question I get in every single talk that I've ever taken. So it's very interesting that this is a common concern, and justifiably so. And I think it is a very, very valid question, because all said and done, the digital space is still something that all of us find something which we know about, but yet there are so many loopholes which seem to come up every day. And it's a very logical conclusion that probably the digital space does tend to get exploited for terror funding. So let me confirm that yes, the digital space gets utilized for terror funding in more ways than one. Firstly, the digital space gets utilized for communicating to people to seek terror funds. Secondly, it gets utilized for motivating people to get terror funding, and also instruments which are essentially of the digital age. I gave you, for example, I gave you the example of PayPal, and I remember using PayPal as long as 15 years back. So that has been one form of digital payment that has been there for, I think, as long as, probably almost as long as eBay has been there. And I'm talking about eBay USA, not when it came to India, much before, even in the US. So yes, there have been cases, for example, of PayPal getting misused. Similarly, you find that you have the money transfer, which has become such a simple way of moving money today. You have various digital methodologies of using them. You have different kinds of agencies which have gotten to digital transfer of money. So look, I think I should just, rather than giving you each potential or possible example, let me just say that, look, when you have the movement of water tends to find its way through the easiest possible channel. And the flow of water is dependent on the diameter of the narrowest pipe that is going to come in the root of the water body. Now, that is exactly what tends to happen with terror funding. Wherever there is an underlying layer of anything that allows the movement of money, which is why I gave you the examples of the formal, the informal, gold, cash, anything which allows the movement of money, and that includes digital, that includes cyber, that includes everything possible. Yes, it gets exploited. It's only a question of how well regulated it is, how well are the security agencies equipped to handle it, and how well are they equipped to stop it. So anywhere where the terror groups find that there are loopholes, it is bound to get exploited. The digital field is no exception.
Sure, sir. So you did touch on the religion aspect of terrorism funding, and we have a question regarding the nexus between politics and religion, and how is this exploited, I guess, and at what point do these contributions become red flags related to terrorism funding?
Okay, so religion gets utilized in both these ways. There could possibly be an institutional attempt to galvanize certain sections of the population which are gullible and which probably in the name of religion would provide the kind of support that you need. It may be for terrorism, it may not be for terrorism at all. Similarly, you have terror groups which have exploited it to the hilt. I think one of the foremost examples that comes to mind, and I'm saying this because at one time at least it was the richest terror organization in the world, and that is the Daesh. I hate to call it Islamic State because that is not what it is. It is Daesh, and that is one group which was one of the richest groups in the world. You have another group which has been again extremely well off in terms of their funding mechanism, and that is the Taliban. Now, again, you find that the religion has been used as a vehicle by the groups there as well. You also find that whether it is religion per se, or it is affiliates of or linkages related to religion, which could have a social angle, which get utilized again by groups. Now, whether it is a genuine cause and the attempt is to collect funds to fight a genuine conflict. I don't want to club everybody into one group, or it is somebody who's exploiting it. The fact is that I think either way it is unacceptable because it tends to give religion, it tends to give certain sections within the society a color which I think they don't deserve, and that is something which must be rejected. Irrespective of which religion, which caste, which group, I think that needs to be unequivocally rejected by the society.
Sure, sir. Sir, I remember we spoke about this of businesses being interested in this. So there's a question from Priyam regards to the discussion on terrorism financing. Can we perceive that the risk of terrorism is credible to both Indian and global businesses? This means that the underlying threat of terrorism just got overlooked by the overwhelming response to COVID-19. So I think it's both the threat of terrorism, I think, overall to both Indian and global businesses. And I think it comes, has terrorism been overlooked during the COVID-19?
Okay. I am not sure if that is indeed the case, and that is the latter part of the question. The threat is real to businesses, but the threat was equally real prior to COVID-19. I can give you examples of both, which are in India and abroad, but let me specifically give you examples in India. Terrorism in Jammu Kashmir, Ladakh is a major factor for businesses of all kinds not being able to deliver in terms of their capacities to the tourists, to the population, and there have been huge losses which have taken place in the past. I've done a paper, so I can just tell you that there have been extremely significant losses that the businesses have faced, for example, in that area. Let me give you another example. In most Naxal areas, I cannot think of any major business which has not been forced to part with a certain part of their income as extortion to the terror groups. I am also aware that when the demonetization happened, and it was my assessment that that terror groups which have larger proportions of their money stacked as currency notes are likely to suffer more. And I thought that the Naxal areas would be the biggest sufferers. But very interestingly, what the Naxal leaders did was they took the money back to those business groups and said, look, here is your money, please take it back, take whatever time you want to take, give us money back in the new currency after 3 months, 6 months, or whatever the case may be. So yes, businesses suffer, and this is something which is routine from a bus which is moving in these areas. And I'm talking about the areas in the northeast, areas in the Naxal zone, where they're giving money for each trip. Taxis which are giving money for each trip, small businesses which are giving a percentage of their income to these groups. So businesses have always suffered, and I would agree that it tends to get worse at times when there is a double whammy. So you have the impact of COVID-19 on businesses, and you also have, of course, the demand which must be coming from these terror groups. So it becomes extremely difficult for them to survive. And I actually, and very unfortunately, I see a lot of them folding up, given the kind of circumstances that they are operating in.
Okay. Sir, I think it's one question is related to the recently passed UAPA Act, basically. And what is your opinion with the evolving definition of terrorism, and by extension, terrorism financing in this new act?
Okay, so UAPA is not a new act. The act is actually quite old, but it has undergone a number of iterations, a number of amendments over a period of time. And if you look at when the amendments have taken place, whether it is 2008, 2012, or 13, you realize that a lot of these amendments actually were concurrent to India attempting to get into the FATF as one of the members. In fact, I think India is the last member that has been taken into the FATF. And the regulations or the guidelines of the FATF required that your systems and your laws should be in line with the global understanding of some of these issues. So a lot of countries, and it's not only India, for example, would have a counterterrorism law, but it does not have a definition of either terrorism or a terrorist act. We are all aware that there is no universal, globally accepted definition of terrorism, but countries are required to put these definitions within their acts, because unless they do so, and this has been happening in India in the past, how do you prosecute somebody for a terrorist act when you don't even have a definition of a terrorist act? Now, since you specifically asked me to comment on the definition itself, I think it's part of, I think, para 15A, if I'm not wrong, of the UAPA. The definition is wide-ranging, and it is in some ways it's a very broad definition that has been given. And I think the intent here is that given the narrow perspective of the definition, people should not be able to exploit the lacuna in the law and get away again, something which has happened in the past. And let me give you an example of the effectiveness of this definition and this act in the recent past. I gave you the example of the judgment of 2014, where not only Pakistan was indicted in that particular case, but there were 6 individuals who were indicted, and they were given punishment for spreading or moving terror currency within the country, all Indian nationals. And each one of them was given life imprisonment for the crime they had committed. So that is the effectiveness of the law, and that effectiveness is actually born because of the nature of amendments that have happened to the law. And since you've only asked of the UAPA, but let me also briefly tell you that a similar kind of effectiveness has been derived in the PMLA. the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Again, that has undergone a number of amendments, and the PMLA today is far more effective as compared to what it was. Now, possibly there is a drift in the question to suggest, can these things be misused? Look, every law, every act can potentially be misused. It is up to us how we ensure that there are safety mechanisms that are built into it, that the state is held to account for what it does. And I think this is where the strength of a democracy, the strength of an open system like ours comes to the fore. It may not be perfect. I guess no system is perfect. But the fact is that, yes, there is always a possibility of misuse of laws. But I think on balance, if you see, largely speaking, the law has been more effective than it has been abused.
Perfect. So you did speak about legal channels being used for money laundering and terrorism financing. Related to, there's a question from Samir Guduru regarding how if these shops that are set up across the country, and I think it's just one of the examples, but have shops like these Pashmina shops or any other shops have been used by terrorists uh, across the board to fund themselves, which most of these shops sometimes don't even make money, but they're still existing. So that related.
So what exactly is the question?
Sorry, sir. I think regarding shop fronts, like the Pashmina shops or any other shops which are used, are these shops also used for terrorism funding?
Okay, potentially, like I said, any place where there is a potential flow of money is a potential source of funding. I gave you the example of the money that you give for a puja or a holy festival or some kind of an event which comes in your neighborhood. Now, if that can get exploited, potentially, I see no reason why a shop cannot be exploited because there are a number of shops where you actually rarely see customers, and they are large, expansive establishments that have got created, which does raise some of the question that you've asked. But the fact remains that unless you have adequate proof and proof that can be utilized to prosecute somebody in the court of law, merely because somebody seems to be suffering losses, you can't just pick him up and put him in jail. But as far as the potential is concerned, absolutely. These are possible places not only for terror funding, these are also possible places for laundering of money. So these are certainly the cases, and I think that I will be surprised if some of these places are not under some kind of observation.
Perfect. Sir, I think Chaitra has a question which is related because terrorism is a very global threat, but we haven't seen a global response or UN and other organizations managing to lead from the front. So is it a failure of international cooperation or lack of political will, or is it something else?
Okay, the easiest answer in all these cases is to say all the above, because it can never be wrong. So is the United Nations at the forefront of fighting terror funding? I wish I could say yes. The fact of the matter is that the UN, by the very nature of its constitution and the fact that it has given the kind of powers to certain countries, and given the environment that we are operating in today, let me be absolutely blunt and mention China. If China can shield a proclaimed named offender who is recognized by the UNSC itself as heading a certain terror organization, I think it indicates to us as to what are the limitations of the United Nations when it comes to spearheading, as you say, the fight against terror funding. I wish they were spearheading. But which is not to say that they've done nothing, because the UNSC resolutions that have come out over a period of time, and if you see the periodicity of these resolutions, most of them actually came out post 9/11. Now, they have provided a context, they have provided a basis through which nations have been able to galvanize whatever support that they could at a multilateral level. They've also laid down certain guidelines that need to be followed. Whether they're able to enforce it or not is a separate issue, but they've certainly laid down certain guidelines, and I think those have helped. But I would focus more on an international body, which is the FATF, which I think has been far more useful, far more effective. And by virtue of the fact that they have a tool which can name and shame an organization without them wanting to say so, but that's exactly what happens, that they can point out the specific lacunas and limitations within the system. And of late, what they have also started doing, they not only point out the limitations in your systems, they also point out the limitations in your intent. And that is exactly what has happened in the case of Pakistan, and that is exactly what differentiates Pakistan from a number of other countries on the grey list. It is by virtue of the fact that they have clearly said that you have not taken adequate action against group A, B, C, D, and E. And I think given the influence that an organization like the FATF has on bodies like the IMF, for example, or the World Bank, who are also indirect members of the organization, it influences the easy flow of loans, it influences the cost of loans, and it influences your standing in the market. And this is why a country like Pakistan, which is otherwise incorrigible and much more, is scared of being placed on the blacklist. So there is absolutely no doubt, however limited that it may be, that they would have suffered by the additional scrutiny that has been placed by the FATF, because it requires financial institutions to do that much more due diligence. And that due diligence means you're spending more money for the scrutiny. And when you spend more money, your loans will be more expensive. So that is where it has been far more effective.
Sir, if you have time, would it be okay if you go 5 or 7 minutes above? We have
sure,
a lot
no
of
problem.
questions actually. And sir,
my wife is also busy with her class, so my haircut has to wait.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. We are thankful to the students of ma'am. But yeah, sir, actually your point on China led us to the next question. Ashutosh has a question: to what extent is China the source of illegal funding, especially typical commercial transactions over under invoicing? Is there any evidence to date in this space?
Okay, let me be for a change fair to China. The replies in the parliament suggest that China is not involved in any overt way of terror funding any group in India at present. And the last replies that I saw was a year or two back. Now, I would go by the veracity of these replies, because my inputs also suggest that the manner in which China was directly involved in the 60s in the Northeast with groups like the NSCN, with groups like the Mizo National Front, and also in terms of training them, equipping them, that kind of obvious, overt, expansive support mechanism does not exist anymore in relation to China. Now, again, I get the drift of what you're saying when it comes to over and under invoicing. It does happen when goods come from China, but I would feel it happens more for businesses attempting to make profit on both the sides, rather than that money going into terror funding. But is the potential there for that money to go into terror funding by this kind of a means of corrupt activities, in a way, money laundering? Yes, it is. So if such a case was to happen, I would not be surprised. But the fact of the matter is that in most cases, and I'm aware of some people who on a regular basis get stuff from there, and I've heard stories of how it gets under invoiced. Even as a routine, unfortunately, it gets under invoiced. Let me give you an example which is personal now, and I can tell you my aim was not either terror funding or money laundering. I have a motorcycle. I was getting certain very small, low-cost parts for my motorcycle. I found them on AliExpress in China, and this was good about a couple of years back. Lest I get thrashed for getting things from China in the recent scenario. So a couple of years back. Now, when I got the goods from there, I paid for it. And when they landed up here, I realized that the money or the amount that was indicated on the invoice was far lower than what I had paid. Now, it was not what I wanted. It was not what I asked them to do, but probably they do it to smoothly go through the custom channels. And again, since you asked this question, let me also indicate to you as to what are the limitations of the customs. We know that there is always a possibility of corrupt practices, and it happens in every institution, it happens in every business. But I think in this particular case, it's also a question of the limitations in terms of their resources. Now, when I did my study a few years back, I realized that the ships which come into the biggest port, the Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust in Mumbai, there were only 2 scanners which were available for scanning shipments, out of which I was told one was dysfunctional at that particular stage. So 1 scanner. So officially, people had been asked to check only 10% of all the shipment which is coming into the country. Now, you can very well imagine that if the official order is 10%, and that is of course done based on the costing involved or the kind of product that is coming, there is always that possibility of a very, very large amount of this kind of stuff which is coming from China actually moving through below the radar. So yes, there is a possibility, but I don't think there is any direct input to suggest as of now that they are funding terrorism in India.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Sir, actually, my experience also with Mumbai Customs when I got my stuff shipped from as a student back when I moved back is also very similar. So yeah, they don't do it as due diligently as they should be doing it. So yeah. Sir, I think there's a question from Radhika. It related to you mentioned about philanthropy and religion being used by FIF to generate funds. How is this overcome as it is not necessarily a red flag?
Yeah, it gets tough because there are 2 factors which come into play when it's a question of philanthropy. One is that philanthropy is considered an honorable pursuit, and at some stage, all of us aspire to do a little more of it in our lifetimes. So it is seen with a certain sense or a certain idea of dignity. The second thing is, as I had mentioned in my presentation, that in many ways or in many cases, it gets linked with certain religious organizations. And religion, at least in India, you all would be aware, is a sensitive issue. So people are very careful before pointing fingers at institutions, organizations which have a religious affiliation. Now, the challenge that comes up is that unless you have substantive evidence to suggest that the organization is in some ways or the other linked with such activities, it is very difficult to stop it. But I think it's not as if that these organizations do not give the opportunity. It's just that the number is so huge that it is very, very difficult to keep each one of them under check. And again, when I did my research, very interestingly, an official MHA report said that they're not aware about the total number of NGOs in the country. Number one. Number two, they said that a very large percentage of NGOs which are getting money from abroad are not filing their returns to suggest as to where the money is coming from and how it is getting utilized. So there is no scrutiny of the money once it comes into the country by chartered accountants or other means, which is necessarily done. Now, these processes have certainly improved over a period of time. So we find that the scrutiny has enhanced, the systems have improved, and it is far better than what it was 5 or 6 years back. But the fact remains that it is extremely difficult. And the last issue is that when an organization is outside your country and is collecting money there and then transferring it through a variety of means into your country, that makes it even more difficult. Because how do you influence an institution, for example, in Pakistan? Now, this is where multilateral cooperation comes in, pressure from countries like the US comes in, the FATF comes in to put these institutions on the map. So that is the best that you can actually do in this particular case.
Sir, I think one question is from Sumair related to how you distinguish between politically motivated terrorism and religious-driven terrorism. We have certain terrorist organizations that become reality as non-state actors in certain countries, especially in the Middle East. And I think he's asking it specifically related to the interplay between geopolitics and state-sponsored terrorism.
Now, this is an unfortunate reality that geopolitics often considers it completely fine, valid, acceptable to utilize terrorism as a state tool. And while I spoke about Pakistan at length, the fact is that there are a number of other countries which have also done the same. While it is becoming that much more difficult over a period of time, and that less acceptable to countries over a period of time to see terrorism being used as, at least openly, as a tool of state policy. But the fact remains that it still remains in vogue, and it depends on which side of the geopolitical divide you sit to make it that much less or more acceptable. But I think there has been a positive movement in the last decade or so. and it is becoming difficult. And I think the case of Pakistan is again a foremost case wherein they could do it with impunity a couple of decades back, but today they find it extremely difficult to pursue it with the kind of gay abandon that they would in the past. So things have changed, things have improved. They're certainly not perfect.
Okay, perfect, sir. Sir, I would club the last two questions, two or three, but just briefly, if you can touch on cyber terrorism, dark web. Also, you spoke about demonetization. Has it in any ways uh, helped in counterfeiting these currency notes? And I think the last would be you spoke about FATF and its involvement in Pakistan and how over the recent, especially in the last 1 year, how much has the pressure of FATF helped in take Pakistan taking any action? So three questions I'm trying to combine because shortage of time.
Okay, let me begin in the reverse order. It's a problem of short memory loss that I have, so I remember the last one. Okay, so as far as the pressure on Pakistan is concerned, the pressure is real. And when you follow the Pakistani media and you follow the steps that they have initiated, it seems that they are under pressure, and there is little doubt about it. Even if you see the statements of their the points person in the FATF that has been sent from Pakistan, the finance minister within their own parliament, the pressure is real, and they realize that they need to do something to get this off the back. Now, the only problem in this case is that Pakistan is brilliant in obfuscating and fooling the world, and they've done it for decades. They have actually they have a PhD in it. They have learned the art of doing just enough to satisfy people, but not that much, which is going to severely affect what they want to do. And they've done it any number of times. They've attempted to play around with the US with this kind of a policy. They've played around with international organizations with this kind of a policy. So will terrorism stop in Pakistan because of the kind of pressure that FATF is able to apply? No. I think it's a contributory factor. It is an important factor, but by itself, it is not enough. Unfortunate reality, but my mind, that is the reality. The logic is, knowing the kind of involvement of Pakistan, the obvious question should be, why isn't it in the blacklist? And when you look at the countries which are in the blacklist, Iran, North Korea, you know why Pakistan is not in the blacklist. You've got to reach that level of castigation by the international authorities. And when I say international authority, well, led by the US, to land up in a list like the blacklist. So till Pakistan reaches that level, they're not going there, irrespective of how many times we read in the media that Pakistan is on the verge. They might just slip inside. They're just hanging by one thread. They're not going in, right? Unless they reach that level. Okay, demonetization. Now, demonetization, to my mind, to begin with, I thought that it would have an impact. And I gave you the reason, the logic why I thought it would have an impact. Because ultimately, it was a question of sucking in the cash currency from the market and to get it back into the system, which meant that somebody had to deposit it somewhere. And any terror group, any insurgent organization which had large reserves of cash, logically should have found it very difficult. Similarly, let us say I am a Hawala dealer and I am moving value from one place to another. Obviously, I have a certain cash amount that is available with me. Now, for a certain period of time, that cash amount obviously would have got squeezed. But logic seems to suggest, and time seems to suggest, that probably for 2, 3, 4, 5 months, there was a cash squeeze, because I think that was one instance when you found terror groups resorting to crime in J&K. You also found that the funding which was meant for people throwing stones had squeezed for a certain period of time. Long run, I don't think it has had a substantive impact. Last point related to digital currency, dark web. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, these are all potential areas for terror funding. They have been used, we know for a fact, but the percentage and the quantum of money which is coming from there still remains limited. But the fact is, yes, these are potential means, and unless we are able to scrutinize them, unless we are able to keep them under check, I think it's going to be an extremely difficult proposition for us.
Great. Thank you, sir. I think from the feedback that I see in the chat section, everyone really found your session insightful and useful. So thank you so much, sir, for taking time. And from your, we know that this is your weekly cycle ride time. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you so much for that. So definitely, I stress said at the start, please do check out sir's work. It's amazing, and he's one of the very few people in India who's definitely looking at terrorism financing in this our regional context. So thank you, sir, for doing this because you do help us researchers actually get the information that we require without actually doing the work ourselves a lot of times. So thank you so much for doing it. And thank you
Thank
everyone
you.
for thank you, sir. And thank you everyone for joining us again on a Saturday morning. And like I said, next week is going to be on humanitarian assistance in the COVID world. So please do join us. We have Dr. Alistair Cook and Christopher Chen from RSIS Singapore. So we look forward to seeing you there too. And keep look out at LinkedIn and other pages for the registration details. Thank you, sir.
Bye bye.
Thank
Have a
you,
good
sir.
day, everyone.
Thank you so much.